This meeting is being recorded.
Good. Okay.
Super. Hello, everybody. Welcome to another CAS seminar. Today we have a talk by Avishek Ray, the author of Vagabond in the South Asian Imagination, Representation, Agency and Resilience, and co-editor of Nationalism and the Public Sphere, Religious Politics in India. Avishek is also a Fulbright-Nehru academic and professional excellence fellow, and currently, if I'm not mistaken, a visiting fellow at the International Research Center for Cultural Studies in Vienna. I will not take any more of our time, and I will give you the floor, Avishek. Thank you very much for being with us.
Here, it's an absolute pleasure to be able to share my ongoing research. So this is still very preliminary and therefore very amorphous. So I'm still like drafting my research. So it's still ongoing. As Marco says, like I'm still pursuing it at IFK Vienna. So this is a 4-month fellowship I'm currently on and still looking at some of the materials that I'm going to share with you. So I'll very briefly talk about where this research comes from, and like it will then lay the context for understanding what exactly why I'm doing what I'm doing. So, like, I mean, the research, it's an accidental research, so to say. I'm not a Roma scholar to begin with, and I have never worked on the Roma people before. But when I was working on the book that Marco mentioned in the introduction, which came out last year, The Vagabond in the South Asian Imagination. So the research that I'm right now doing occurs as a tiny footnote in the book. So the book, in very brief words, the book is about the idea of the vagabond. And when I say people that I work on the vagabond, people assume that it's a fun thing. I do ethnography and I work on the streets and I interview vagabonds and mobile people, but that hasn't been the case so far. It's a pure, I would call it more like a Foucauldian research in the sense that it is completely genealogical so far as I looked at the concept of the vagabond in the sense that why and how we started labeling certain mobile / itinerant people as vagabond. So it was more of a kind of a genealogical / discursive / genealogical formation of the category vagabond. And what I argued in the book was the fact that how the value system in the Western perception differs from the non-West. And I take South Asia as a case study, and I illustrate that there are certain elements which sometimes involve prophetic values that the South Asian imagination often attaches to the figure of the vagabond, whereas in the West, the vagabond, I mean, a quick demonstration would be if you type the word vagabond in Google Images, necessarily the images that you will see are images of urban poor people. As opposed to what I argue in my book is the figure of the vagabond is not necessarily poor, and I show with a number of citations that there are people who self-profess themselves as vagabond. They love to call themselves a vagabond precisely because they have a political will, and their idea of traveling the way that the statist discourse otherwise label as vagabond or vagabondage has got to do with a certain political will that is embedded in their certain very vulnerable way of traveling. So I use a number of case studies. I'm not going into that direction because that will deviate us from today's discussion. So in the book, I use this as a footnote because I was rather startled that the Roma's way of traveling, the way the Roma people travel, has often been labeled as a typically Indian sentiment. And you know that Roma are now believed to have originated from India and all of that. So I was rather startled how this connection between the Roma's kind of being mobile. So that's a typical characteristic. The Roma is a mobile in a typically Romani kind of way, as opposed to the way that we love to travel. So, I mean, the scholars love to characterize the Roma people based on their desire to travel. So it's a very specific or a spatial desire to travel, and that is then married to the idea of Indianness. So this connection kind of puzzled and startled me, and this appears as a footnote in my book. And I thought that there are more materials and there's scope for more research into this. So I mean, that's what I'm right now doing. I'm trying to trace this connection between Indianness and Roma, and I'm looking at, and again, I should mention it right at the onset that my research doesn't concern the Roma people as such. I'm more interested in the scholars and the scientists who made this connection possible, and I'm more, so my intervention today is going to be from the history and philosophy of science point of view. So I mean, I'm not commenting on the Roma people as such, nor I'm qualified to, because as I said, I'm not a Roma scholar myself. So what I'm going to do today is to look back and re-examine some of the scholarship about Roma, of course, in connection to their origin that has been furnished over the course of last 200 years or so. So I'm more interested in how these scientific, quote unquote, scientific claims were furnished, and what were the logic, what were the rationale that was, put forth in order to advance the claim of the Indian origin. So I have a draft, somewhat very preliminary draft before me. So I'll go back between the draft and speaking. So Romani people have been framed as a problem, as you know, in Europe since at least the 18th century. Ethnographers and linguists identified origins and characteristics, while demographers have sought to ostracize them in different ways. And meanwhile, I mean, what I just mentioned, is large number of typically Orientalist scholars claimed that the Roma people originated from India. So this research, if you look back, I mean, it was most often, I mean, historically speaking, this was first evidenced by philological linguistic evidences, and then anthropological historical evidences, then even serological, and now what we have is genetic evidences. So we have these. In the course of my talk, I'll talk about this, what I call the three paradigms of evidentiality. First, philology, linguistics; next, history, anthropology; and then serology, genetics. And if you look, I mean, very carefully examine this, each of these research strands, when they come into the picture, they claim themselves to be more scientific and therefore more conclusive than the other. So I mean, there's a historical progression into it. Like you have linguistics here, you have anthropology, history here, and then you have serology and genetics, which is kind of the mother of all evidence. That's the gold standard of evidence. But the fun thing is the search for origin of the Romani, based on a structural analysis of Romani languages, started as early as the 18th century. And the premise of this claim in most instances rests on family resemblance, sometimes rather flimsy, between Romani and certain Indic languages. So I call this flimsy because I don't have the time to get into details, but there are a bunch of scholars before me who have pointed to why these linguistic connections that the linguists have made over the course of last 200 years. And there are certain loopholes. I mean, no one is discounting it. No one is, saying those are unscientific and so on and so forth. But what certain linguists have identified, there are certain loose ends, and there are certain problems which are still unresolved. And there are also, the kind of linguistic evidence that the linguists themselves use are not unanimously agreed among the linguists. So there are disagreements among the linguists insofar as what constitutes as evidence. So departing from here, what I focus on is how scholars and savants have sought to understand Roma populations, particularly in relation to their purported Indian origin and what it entails epistemologically. It examines how the historical seismic breaks from Orientalist to post-Orientalist, from structuralist to post-structuralist, and from colonial to post-colonial have altered the gaze with which scholars approach the Roma as an object of study, reinforcing the Indian origin theory, by which I mean I talk about these changes like Orientalist, post-Orientalist, post-structuralist, post-structuralist. What I'm trying to argue is like this, each of these eras would have their own way of positing the Roma as an object of study, and they have their own set of methodologies with which they approach the Roma as an object of study and try to reinforce this Indian origin theory. The problem is not so much with the theory as with the pervasive tendency in some quarters to pass it as a scientific truth. I think this is the crux of my paper here, because I'm trying to make a distinction between a theory and what most scientists in the discourse of the Roma origin would pass as a scientific truth. So in other words, what I'm suggesting is a theory in itself is neither true nor false. So if you go by the scientific literature, if you invoke your Thomas Kuhn, Karl Popper, and so on and so forth, they would say, like, so far as a theory is concerned, it only explains things in the world. And the job of a theory is to make you explain things easily or more conveniently. Say, for example, the string theory in theoretical physics. So the problem is not whether, I mean, no physicist has ever seen a string to begin with, but the theory still holds true because it allows you to explain a number of other odd realities that you see around the world. So my problem is that, I mean, that's what I'm going to get into in a moment, that some of the scientists that invoke these theories, they try to pass it as a historical truth rather than a theory. So, so the recent findings from genetic mapping, by which I refer to the DNA mapping, of course, in fact strengthen the Indian origin theory. So, however, my argument is not based along the lines of veracity. What I am rather concerned with is the epistemic conditions under which the Roma, or more precisely their origin, was deemed worthy of study. The originary theory was advanced and reappropriated, and the stakes involved therein. Put differently, why are savants since the 18th century, after rediscovering this primordial connection between India and Roma, I mean, a problem that the Roma doesn't seem to care less about. I mean, if you go out and talk to the Romas, I mean, they don't care about it. So why would a problem that the Romas themselves have no interest in would have startled these scholars for over 250 years or so? If after all the Roma's Indian origin is a theory, what kind of theory it is? Is it analytical, deductive, inductive, and so on? Why did the philological evidence, what was deemed sufficient and valid in the 19th century, seek revalidation from genetic evidence within a gap of some 200 years? So in other words, what I'm suggesting, if the linguistic evidence was considered evidence 200 years ago, why did it require to be buttressed by more scientific genetic or serological evidence within a short period of 200 years? So, so this also calls forth about like revisiting the theories of evidentiality and what constitutes evidence in what era, and of course I'm referring to Foucault here, the prevailing epistemic conditions that render certain evidences in certain historical time. So what I'm trying to ask is then these shifting standards of evidentiality, how does it fit into claims of scientificity, and is it then after all a function of time? So I'll quickly now move to the slides. Maybe I'll give you a quick yeah. So before that, also let me tell you what the breakdown of today's discussion. I'll quickly I have broken that down into 3 parts, and the more pertinent question, I mean, which is probably it's pretty obvious by now. The more pertinent question here is perhaps not whether the Roma originated from India, but what are the epistemological implications of the Roma-India connection, provisionally assuming they did. So I call I say provisionally assuming because also let me make it very clear right at the onset that my own position in this regard is very similar to like that of an agnostic, in the sense that I neither believe nor disbelieve in the claim. So I'm approaching it very distantly. I keep a critical distance here, and I approach it from an outsider. The reason is pretty simple. Like, I'm trained as a cultural historian, and I have no training, no methodological expertise to test the validity of the claims made so far. So I mean, those are either linguistic philological claims, like very require a very intricate linguistic training if I were to examine them myself, and also like the genetic and serological stuff is totally out of question. Like I'm like 1,000 miles away from the kind of methodologies that they use. So in this case, unfortunately, I cannot test the validity myself. So what I do, provisionally speaking, I assume, let me concede that they did originate from India, and then that's where my intervention begins. So that's why I refer to as like I'm provisionally assuming they originated from India. So how has evidencing the Roma's Indian origin sustained as a crucial academic agenda among scholars across centuries and across disciplines, particularly when the theory is embraced and declined by the Roma in equal proportion? So in other words, why does the question of origin continues to be a question worth having answers to? And more importantly, like when, you know, at least the genetic infrastructures, when they were employed, I find it rather, it's reinventing the wheel. So they were actually proving what has already been proven 200 years ago. So it's kind of reinventing the wheel. So that's kind of very surprising. So here I problematize the Indian origin theory as a knowledge project with reference to the prevailing episteme, of course. And in the three following sections, I'm going to talk about, number one, the constitution of the problematic of the origin arising from an epistemic amalgamation. I'll explain that in a moment, what I call epistemic amalgamation between gypsy studies and folklore studies. I'm going to demonstrate how these converge in the 19th century. So number one, I'm going to talk about how the problematic was constituted as an object of study. When did scholars start investigating that? Number two, I'm going to talk about regimes of scientific truth claim as a critical praxis informed by ideological dispositions. In other words, I'm going to show you how certain ideological biases and certain other academic prejudices to begin with feed into how scientists make scientific claims. And number three, I'm going to talk about social reproduction of scientific paradigms, by which I refer to the fact that after a point, once a bunch of scientists pass this as a scientific theory, then you will have the subsequent generations, they just reproduce it and reiterate it without critically questioning it. So that's what I'm going to show, how how some of the academic biases in the linguistic research would then be passed on to the genetic scientists. So they begin with the same premise or the same set of hypotheses without looking into or adequately problematizing their hypothesis to begin with. So those are the three sections I'm going to touch upon in today's discussion. So the Indian origin theory, I mean, historically speaking, was advanced by this guy called, forgive my German pronunciation, I don't speak German. This guy is called Heinrich Moritz Grellmann. Like, he's kind of the founding father of Romani studies at that point, referred to as gypsology, to be precise, historically speaking. And this was as early as 1783. So he had this book on of course, like I'm referring to, I mean, I'm citing to the way he cited, like the gypsies, although I understand this is not a correct way of putting it at this point of time, but he called his book The Gypsies. And this was the first venue where the Roma's purported Indian origin would become an object of academic scrutiny. So as early as 1783. So I really underscore the date here as something of immense historical importance, And I try to juxtapose this with how the scholarly interest on the Roma was developing parallelly with the scholarly interest in folklore. So I'll present you with some evidence here. What you see, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Can you see my
screen?
Yeah. Okay, so what you see here is, again, like, forgive my German pronunciations here. So Harder's book on folk songs would be published in 1778. Grimm Brothers' book on fairy tales came out in 1812. And the words that you see in the first line, like folk song, folk soul, folk belief, folk literature, folk poetry, these were the words that were being incorporated into the English, French, German vocabularies. I mean, the lexical inclusions of these words into the vocabulary. And after Harder, especially nature poetry, the term nature poetry would be exceedingly popular and be regarded as like the gold standard of all poetic practice. And parallelly, if you see literally the folklore societies in Europe and UK, Great Britain at that point of time were literally mushrooming. The English Folklore Societies, 1878, American Folklore Society, 1888, German Folklore Society, and a bunch of regional chapters that you can see here on the slide. So what I'm trying to draw your attention to is, I mean, these two phenomena, as in the interest in the Roma people and the interest in folklore as objects of study, cannot be studied in isolation. So accordingly, so the constitution of gypsology as an academic field owes much to the guy that I referred to, Grellman, while he was very instrumental in founding what we now know as the Gypsy Lore Society that was founded in 1888 in Great Britain. And Grellman was very instrumental in setting it up, and it was like a constellation of subsequent generation of Gypsy studies scholars. They will cluster around this society. But what I'm trying to draw your attention to is notably the first generation of Gypsy studies scholars were, besides history, equally interested in the lore of the Gypsies, as evident in the name of the society. I mean, that's very telling. I mean, it's a Gypsy lore society to begin with, and accordingly, the Journal of the Gypsy Lore Society that emerged as a testing ground for the Indian origin theory, by which I refer to the fact that most of the scholars who advanced this Indian origin theory would publish their articles first in the Journal of the Gypsy Lore Society. For the several following decades would carry historical accounts and folklore concerning the Gypsies in parallel. And what you see here now is, oh, okay, before I go into that, let me also, sorry, I missed this. So what you see here, so what you see here is like a graph from Google's application, Google Ngram. For those of you who are not familiar with Ngram, let me tell you. I mean, it's basically an application which allows you to search with certain keywords, and what it does is, on the left axis, you see the relative frequency of the two words with which I performed my search with, the words being gypsy and folklore, and Google shows you the rate of frequency with which these words appear over a course of a particular period of time, in which I have shortlisted to 1850 to 1900. And this is the rate of frequency with which the words appears in Google's entire source of Google's archive Google has ever archived. So this is the rate of frequency with which these two words appear in Google's archive. So what you can see before your screen is the fact that over the period of 1850 till the turn of the century, the two words, the popularity or the valence of the two words were rising in parallel, and it would reach towering height till at the turn of the century. So they were picking up momentum almost parallelly. The popularity of the two words, it was gaining traction parallelly. So this is my point. This is what I'm trying to draw your attention to. And then I come to as I said, if you look into the first, right here. So this is the first issue of the Journal of the Gypsy Lore Society, which came out in July 1888. As you see, I'm not sure if the table of, so this is the table of contents page, and I'm not sure if it is legible, but let me read it out, whatever that is relevant. So I'm trying to draw your attention to see the content number 2, 3, and 4. So the second content is early annals of the gypsies in England. Number 3 is a Romanian gypsy folktale. Number 4 is a statistical account of the gypsies in the German Empire. So what I'm trying to draw your attention to is, I mean, there's no generic distinction. I mean, it presents gypsy folktales, early annals, statistical accounts, like all genres are kind of, merged. And this is what I referred to as, what I referred right at the onset, is the epistemic amalgamation. This is what I call amalgamation, because they're amalgamating a number of odd genres all together as a mixed bag when they present their findings on the gypsies. So when I look back at some of the early issues of the journal, this particular affinity for history and folktale catches my attention. It is, of course, German here. I said like how these different genres are being clubbed together. So in retrospect, it is rather unsurprising that subjecting the Roma's ethnicity as an object of scholarly inquiry has had a strong parallel with the emergence of anthropology as a discipline. And people who are interested in history of anthropology would now remember how anthropology in the very initial days would owe much to, the whole business of investing in race, ethnicity, so on and so forth. And that has again a connection with folklore, especially in the German speaking world. This whole business of the quest for origin and so on and so forth. And that is part and parcel of the disciplinary bias of folklore studies and by extension anthropology. So, however, according to Judith Oakley is a very instrumental scholar in the kind of work that I'm doing, because she was, I think she was in Oxford or Cambridge, should be very elderly at this point, might have well been retired. But she is a very important figure in our discussion today, because she was one of the first scholar to look at this claim very critically. So her book came out as early as 1983. I forget the name of the book. I have it in the bibliographic references. I'm happy to share with you if you are interested. But I mean, this is a landmark publication insofar as critical Roma studies is concerned. She asked a number of questions in the book. The two most important questions being whether it is epistemologically fair to connect cultural traits with race. I mean, is it possible? Because so there are certain cultural traits like itinerancy, mobility, gypsy kind of music, so on and so forth. You could multiply it. It could A, B, C, D, whatever that is. So these are traits. These are cultural traits to begin with, and you weld them together with ideas of race. I mean, there are also parallel theories. Certain scholars also argued that the Roma people originated from Anatolia, Turkey. Certain people said Macedonia, Greece. Certain people said Egypt. So there were parallel theories, but eventually in the long run, those theories were dislodged and the Indian theories were, they superseded the other theories, mainly because of genetic findings. So I'm not going into details, but the fundamental question that Judith Oakley raised is whether it is epistemologically fair. I mean, forget about the precise origin, whether be it India, Egypt, Turkey, whatever that is. So marrying cultural traits with race or ethnicity, I mean, which today in retrospect is in most instances the the fundamental premise of racism to begin with. So Judith O'Keefe first asked, like, is it epistemologically fair to do so? And number two, she asked, like, that's what I'm going to read it out. However, according to O'Keefe, I quote, gypsies were hardly studied in anthropology before the 1970s, while for the first 7 decades of anthropology, the field was left entirely to amateur folklorists. So that's the other charge that Judith O'Keefe would level against the gypsy studies scholars, because most of the knowledge produced in the early decades, 7 decades or so, in Judith O'Keefe's words, was produced by amateur folklorists, not by historians, not by anthropologists, and so on and so forth. So one can juxtapose these observations. I mean, these observations I refer to as the observations furnished in the Journal of the Gypsy Lore Society, with, of course, with O'Keefe's observations. So you put these two in contrast. So put differently, the historiographic enterprise, and that's what I'm now suggesting, drew on anthropology, philology, in as much as folkloristics, treating them as equally valid source of historical knowledge. So there was no distinction. So anthropological knowledge, historical knowledge, knowledge obtained from the study of folklore were all treated at par. They were all recognized as equally valid historical source of knowledge. So this is the first problem that I identify in what I refer to as the constitution of the problematic of origin, because the constitution of the problematic of origin was fundamentally premised upon amalgamating these three totally different strands of disciplinary inquiry. So notwithstanding Foucault's critique of how taxonomies around bounded classifiers entail exclusionary politics, I mean, I'll break this down now for easier understanding. I mean, if you look into Foucault's archaeology of knowledge, like, long story short, what Foucault says is, when we make distinction between disciplines, what we do is we exercise a politics of inclusion and exclusion, and by which we perpetrate epistemic violence, because there's a politics of inclusion and exclusion, like what is geography and what is not, what is linguistics and what is philology. If you're trying to make this distinction, we are by default exercising certain choices, certain subjective choices of inclusion and exclusion. That is something Foucault has problems with. That is his fundamental thesis in archaeology of knowledge. But I contend, and I'm going to contradict. I'm going to contradict Foucault here. I mean, if instituting disciplinary difference is a problem, in Foucault's words, what we have here is a classic case of just the reverse. We have the opposite spectrum here. And I contend that conversely, the practice of not adequately distinguishing between philology and folklore, and more importantly, their craft methodologies and validity, what I refer to as the epistemic amalgamation, paraphrasing Foucault, in this case, poses an equally serious problem that has far-reaching impacts on the Roma-related knowledge thus produced. So, I mean, what I'm trying to push now is, like, the practice of not distinguishing the disciplines and their methodologies would be an equally serious problem here. So this is not, however, to say that this amalgamation was tactically or strategically achieved, but I rather argue that given the cousin disciplines, and that's what Judith O'Keefe said, I mean, these were cousin disciplines. They were kind of emerging at around the same time. They were kind of having same kind of object of inquiry. Certain methodological tools were borrowed from this and the other. So in that sense, they were cousin disciplines to begin with, and by which I refer to anthropology, comparative philology, folkloristics. These were in many sense cousin disciplines. So what I say is that disciplinary boundaries were still fuzzy, and methodological apparatuses still uncannily overlapping. And that's why the gypsy studies scholar who drew on this did not have the heuristic tools to treat them differentially. Neither they had any concern to weigh their relative validity for arriving at historical knowledge. In short, they did not deem it methodologically necessary. I mean, they didn't have the methodological tools. They didn't even consider it necessary. So I'm not trying to say that this was a very tactical achievement. They wanted very strategically planned to achieve this, that, or the other. So that's not my argument. I'm saying under the remit of the prevailing episteme, like they had no clue how and why this methodological distinction must be attended to. So that's my point number one. I'll get to point number two, which is the question of science and ideology. And yeah, so what you see here now, I'll show you a slide. Yeah. So this is the first quote on the top is by Francis Hindes Groom. He's an English guy. He was a disciple of the other person, like the Grellman. He was Grellman's disciple to begin with, and he's one of the instrumental figures who clustered around the Gypsy lore society. So his book on the Gypsies came out in 1899, as you see, barely a decade after the Gypsy Lore Society was founded. And this is what I take from the preface. This is a prefatory remark that appears in the introduction of his book, the quote that you see. So he says, "I am no folklorist." And this is important because, I mean, this has to be read in a very nuanced way, because I mean, in English we call this antiphrasis, in the sense that when he says I am no folklorist, he actually means that he is a folklorist. It's a sign of utmost humility. When I say like, no, I don't know about this, of course there's a humility in it. I mean that I know about it. So this has to be read as an antiphrasis. That's what we call it. English. So he says, "I'm no folklorist. I have merely dabbled in folklore and also intricate problems of philology, ethnology, craniology, archaeology, history, music, and what not besides." So I mean, this is a classic illustration that shows that how scholars of the Roma actually considered themselves expertise of so many disciplines at the same time. And there was, as I said, no methodological distinction. So this is his prefatory remark in his book called Gypsy Folktales, where he rather reinforces his identity as a folklorist. But very interestingly, if you see the second quote that you see, 1967, and this is an article that Jones publishes in the Journal of American Anthropological Society. He writes this article in 1967, revisiting Groom's works. It's kind of he kind of reevaluates, looks back and reevaluates Groom's contribution in Romani studies. So this is what he writes in his article while he estimates Groom's contribution. Jones says, Groom's reticence to be draws our attention to Groom's reticence to be considered a folklorist. Groom never appeared on the English Folklore Society's membership, nor did any folklorist publish any obituary for him in the Society's journal. Groom, more than anyone else, was a Gypsy scholar. So in other words, so he's saying Groom was not a folklorist. Basically, if you read the quotation here, he's saying that Groom was, I mean, he's alerting the readers that for God's sake, do not consider Groom as a folklorist. So in other words, what I'm trying to draw your attention to is the contradiction. Groom is saying I'm a folklorist, and Jones is saying no, Groom, do not consider Groom as a folklorist. So this contradiction is important because, as you see, the idea of a scholar in Jones's imagination is premised upon an imaginary dichotomy between folklorist and scholasticism, by which I refer, like in Jones's imagination, I mean, and this is where I draw on Foucault, like over a course of some 70 years, look at how the language and the whole concept of scholasticism changes. So what Jones in Jones's imagination, you can no longer be a scholar if you are just a folklorist. So, I mean, the whole imagination and the constituency of scholasticism is my object of interest here. So the idea of scholar in Jones's imagination is premised upon an imaginary dichotomy between folklorist and scholasticism, and conversely, an imaginary coupling between the discourse of scholasticism and that of history. I mean, in other words, you have to be a historian in order to make your mark as a scholar. You can no longer claim your expertise as a scholar if you are just a folklorist. I mean, that is the change that happens in over a course of just 70 years. So by negating Groom's folklorist identity, in a way, he attempts to redeem Groom retroactively in order to make Groom appear a genuine historian, the writer of what he calls the most genuine history of the Romani people. Jones sought to obliterate his associations with folkloristics, for by the 20th century, scholarly inquiries into the category gypsy had become the prerogative of what Foucault calls the human sciences. So you have to be an expertise of human science, by which you have to be an expert of history, anthropology, and so on. So just your expertise on folklore or a bunch of other disciplines, as you see, like philology, ethnology, craniology, archaeology, doesn't qualify you to be a scholar to make inquiries into the gypsy anymore. So broadly speaking, Jones's articulation is indicative of the shift from the 19th century model, exemplified by Groom, as you clearly see, away to the late 20th century model of the gypsy studies scholar who ought to be an expert on the human sciences. Hereafter, Roma-related inquiries that previously did not warrant any particular expertise, that is also exemplified by Groom's quote. I mean, he says that he has expertise on a number of other things. So it didn't warrant any one expertise to begin with, as such, would be brought into the remit of human sciences. I mean, if you, especially, I mean, the post-war discourse of expertise and the whole business of, you know, the way the university system function. And I mean, Edward Said has a lot to say on this in his work on the public intellectual, and how the whole business of the way the university took off, especially after the post-war period, had got to do with you know, a certain idea of instrumental notion of expertise. So I'll probably, I don't have much time. I'll probably wind up in 5 minutes. Is that good? Yeah. Okay. Okay. So yeah. So in other words, yeah, let me see what I have in my slide. I'll skip maybe a little bit. Yeah. Yeah, so maybe I'll quickly, this is one other point that I wanted to mention. So what you see before, I mean, it's a long quote. I'm not going to read it out. You can read it on screen, but I'll quickly give you the background. So this quote is taken from this recently published book by Mihai Surdu. It's a 2016 publication, and the book is called Those Who Count. I mean, the book concerns like expertly practices of Roma classification, and Surdu talks about, I mean, the problems with classification and taxonomies. And this is a very interesting account that Surdu presents. I mean, Surdu was a part of a number of teams, including certain genetic inquiry teams. So he was a part of a number of teams that studied Roma, especially in the 90s and early 2000s. So he kind of narrates his own experience in one of these experiences that I just shared with you. So he talks about how where there is a significant number of Roma pupils in a school, and you will have expert teams visiting the school, what they would do is they curate certain especially cultural song and dance program, of course, drawing on the Indian cultural heritage, and they will make the students perform those quote unquote Indian song and dance numbers. And the experts would then, you know, gathered that the Roma students perform Indian dances, for example. So what Surdu argues in his book, and which is interesting in the course of today's discussion, is the fact that how this looping, the looping effect of knowledge, because in a way, what the experts think as being produced by the Roma themselves were actually curated, which the experts have no clue of. So I'll draw on Ian Hacking here, Ian Hacking's book on the social construction of what. It's a classic book in the discussions of history of science, because I take this part from Ian Hacking, because Ian Hacking has to say a lot about how we classify and how we taxonomize human subjects as opposed to non-living objects. And Hacking's point is as follows. He says non-living objects do not have agencies or subjectivities. When I classify my computer as computer or my water bottle as water bottle, the water bottle cannot respond to my classification because they are non-living things to begin with. As opposed to living things, when I classify human subjects or living subjects, the subjects are aware of my classification. In other words, if a quick example would be, if you recall your Judith Butler Bodies That Matter, like once I know that I am classified as a male, I behave in a certain way that is likely to be representative of the male behavior. So when I classify certain people as gay, homosexual, communist, and so on and so forth, by the fact that they are aware that they are so classified, by the fact that I am aware that I am classified as a male, I start to behave in a certain way. That's what Judith Butler would call performativity. So I perform my identities the way that scholars and savants have classified myself as X. I started to behave as X. So that's the problem with classifying human subjects. That's Ian Hacking's point. And Ian Hacking kind of pushes this argument, and rather provocatively, and he says, in thinking in that sense, certain communities exist only when scholars classify them as X. So that's Hacking's point. So what we have, what we gather from Surdu's narrative is this kind of this looping effect, where, as I say, like what scholars think to have emerged from the Roma people themselves is actually curated and archived and so on and so forth. So there's a looping effect in place insofar as scientific claims are concerned. So in other words, what I'm trying to draw your attention is to the fact that look how much of your finding is already embedded in your hypothesis. So you already when you go to the school as a member of an expert team, let's say, what you're finding is already embedded in your hypothesis. So that's the kind of scientific prejudice or bias that I was trying to refer to. So I'll stop here with one more slide and I'll wind up in 2 minutes, which is like a personal anecdote, but though not relevant. I think I have names here. It might not be a good idea to show it because you are recording it. Maybe I'll stop sharing the screen and I'll read it out for you, because I don't want to go it on screen. Yeah, so this is a personal narrative. So I was in Bulgaria a couple of years back on a research fellowship, and they wanted me to convene a conference precisely on the matters that I'm speaking today, which is problematizing the Indian origin theory, because there are several loose ends, as I started this conversation saying. So we kind of thought that we'll revisit these loose ends. No one was trying to disprove the Indian origin theory, of course, but we were trying to be critical and revisit some of the claims. So that's what we wanted to do. So we drafted the call for papers, the conference note, and everything was circulated. But the conference didn't take place because it didn't garner sufficient interest. No one was interested in it. And most interestingly, the two keynote speakers that I sent my invitation to, so I had the quotes that I took off, I didn't show you because I had the names in it, actually were emails from these two people who were invited as keynote speakers. And I'll read it out, maybe one of their emails, so that it is clear what I'm trying to demonstrate. So this person, had impeccable credibility, impeccable academic credibility when it comes to Roma studies. They have been the president of Roma boards and like donor and financial organizations, editors of, there are two Roma studies journals at the moment, two good journals. They have served as editors for those journals. So you take it from me, like they have impeccable credibility when it comes to Roma studies as a discipline. And this person declines my invitation, saying, I don't consider it worth the endeavor to discuss something which is not contested in academia for more than 200 years. This is a very befitting reply, but very symbolic in terms of what I'm trying to get at here. She is basically saying, let's not look into things that has not been problematized for the last 200 years. So in other words, if you invoke your Thomas Kuhn here, in other words, she is saying, let's practice normal science. Let's not problematize things that have not been problematized for 200 years. And the other quote I have, which is of course denunciatory, it's a slightly longer quote, but along the same lines, of course, where I have been compared to a Holocaust denier. And he said that I have never come across any conference other than those organized by Holocaust deniers. And so it was kind of funny, but what it points to, you realize the fact that the reluctance on part of scholars who are not wanting to look at things critically, because as I say, these are questions that most scientists reinforce, and after a point it becomes self-serving, and you socially keep on reproducing them, and you revalidate and ratify them, but you never look at them critically. I'll stop here. Thank you so much. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you very much for a very interesting talk.